opposition to the Nazis, particularly focusing on the war years, but also from 1933 onwards, really, from when Hitler came to power. There were three different types of opposition that came about. The first one is probably provided the weakest threat to Hitler, which was plain simple grumbling, moaning, and this would happen in the homes, in secure locations. People would just moan about Hitler, really, and maybe make jokes about him. It's not going to change anything. It's not really a threat to him. You then have passive resistance. And this would have involved, for example, in 1936, there's a famous picture where lots of workers at an industrial plant are saluting Hitler with a Hitler salute, and one man there doesn't do it in the whole crowd. He refuses to go along with that. And that is an example of passive resistance. Again, it's not active resistance. He's not doing anything. He's just refusing to do something. Another one might be if a Hitler Youth, I remember the Hitler Youth came round, knocked on your door asking for a donation, and you refuse to give that money. Again, you're not doing anything. You're just refusing to do something. And then, of course, you probably have your biggest threat to Hitler, and it's the one that he cared about the most. It's the one where the Gestapo, for example, would have spent a lot of time trying to prevent, which is your active resistance. What we're going to do in this tutorial is just look at some of the most famous examples of resistance in Nazi Germany. Starting off with young people, and there's two groups that I'd like to draw your attention to here. The first one was a group of working class young people going by the name of the Edelweiss Pirates. Edelweiss was a flower, a picture of which you can see on the screen now. They were a group of young people who refused to enter the Hitler Youth, for example. They would hang around in a gang. They would attack members of the Hitler Youth, beat them up, intimidate them, smoke, drink, cause general trouble, and they were working class. They might go off and maybe into the forest and smoke and swear and be teenagers, really, but essentially they were anti-Nazi. They were anti-fascist as well. Most famous case, really, of the Edelweiss Pirates kind of becoming notorious would have been in November 1944, when a number of them were executed by hanging in Cologne. And again, I'll try and put a picture on here of that now. So you can see the impact that they had was limited because they were children. They were all, most of them were under the age of 16. They were still executed in this instance. But really, threat level is pretty low for the Edelweiss Pirates. But you then also have, I suppose, similar threat level would be the swing types, or the swing kids, as they were known. The swing types or swing kids would have been middle class youngsters who would have enjoyed listening to jazz music. Of course, Hitler and the Nazis weren't fans of jazz music because it resonated or it originated from black people. It encouraged frivolous dance routines, which a lot of Nazi leaders obviously didn't think was right. It came from black people. The swing middle class would have listened to jazz. They would have been heavily influenced by American culture. They would have worn American style clothing. They would have tried to change their fashion in maybe perhaps in an American influence. The Nazis, of course, if you look at the tutorial on women, particularly had very set ideas on how women should act. And the swing types just basically didn't go along with it. Again, smoking, drinking, hanging about, causing trouble, but causing trouble for the Nazis, I suppose. Certainly they wouldn't be attending the Hitler Youth, even when it became compulsory. They would stay out of it. But again, these two groups, you're Adolf Hitler, you're looking at those two groups, and you're really not seeing them as too much of a threat. They haven't got weapons. They're kids. They're kids who don't like you. Perhaps slight, but then again, it's the ideas that these groups brought about that perhaps worried the Nazis more than anything. And a really good example of a group who really had an ideological, so they had a complete opposite set of ideas to the Nazis, was the White Rose group. And the White Rose group was led by Hans and Sophie Scholl, brother and sister. And Hans and Sophie Scholl set up this group called the White Rose Group, who, and really their opposition for the Nazis came from their hatred of the way that Jews were being treated, defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, treatment of other minorities. So Sophie Scholl was very in her journal, she wrote about the treatment of disabled people, for example, at the hands of the Nazis. Hans and Sophie Scholl were attending Munich University, and in Munich University they did a leaflet drop, and that leaflet drop was a print of the White Rose's manifesto, and they were caught by the Gestapo, and obviously they were interrogated. They were sent to the People's Court. They had to appear in front of Roland Freisler. Again, you can see about Roland Freisler on the Propaganda and Terror tutorial. They were forced to stand in front of Roland Freisler. They were found guilty, and they were actually executed in February 1943 by guillotine on Hitler's request. They were executed by guillotine. A very nasty way to die. They were students. Sophie Scholl herself was 21 at the time, age 21. She was a young girl. You know, is Sophie Scholl a threat to the Nazi regime? Well, in terms of what she has, what she can do, well, no. But in terms of perhaps her ideas, the Nazis did see her as a threat. Again, she was also a very, very strong Christian, Protestant. She had a very strong faith in God, and I think this helped her to stand up to the regime and to do what she felt she needed to do. And many, many streets and buildings in Germany today are named after Sophie Scholl, despite the fact that actually in Britain and other countries she's not particularly well known. Moving on from there to other groups, you also have opposition from some church leaders. I talked on another clip about the how the Nazis control religion. So by signing an agreement with the Pope called the Concordat, by creating their own Protestant church, they really wanted to control Christians across Germany because potentially they could have been a powerful group. But two notable people from that community who actually stood up to the Nazis, one was Bishop Gallen of Munster. Bishop Gallen, in 1941, made a very, very famous sermon from the pulpit of his church where he lambasted, he criticised the Nazis' methods when it came to their euthanasia program against mentally ill and disabled people. This program was actually called the T4 program, and it involved basically injecting mentally ill and disabled people with poison and executing them. Hitler's view, of course, was that he wanted this so-called superior race, and one aspect of that was the eradication of mentally ill and disabled people. Bishop Gallen made this speech in 1941, and the Nazis, of course, didn't know he was going to make this speech. But they couldn't really do anything about Bishop Gallen because he was a high-profile Catholic bishop. If they had have sent him off to a concentration camp, then there would have been perhaps a massive reaction from the Christian community in Germany. So what they actually did is they temporarily halted the T4 program. It started up again about a year or two later, but they did halt it because of the speech he made. So you might actually cite Bishop Gallen as one example of success in his opposition. Others also famously, so for example, you have Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You might want to look him up and what he did, but just briefly, he eventually was sent to a concentration camp because he campaigned fiercely against the Nazis over a long period of time. Eventually ended up, he was very outspoken, obviously, but he ended up in a concentration camp and was executed shortly before the end of the war. Martin Niemoller, former U-boat captain, also set up the Confessional Church in 1937. The Confessional Church was an alternative church to the National Right Church, so he set up essentially an anti-Nazi church in 1937 called the Confessional Church. But that was later banned, and Martin Niemoller was sent off to a concentration camp as well. So mixed opposition within the church, but certainly some more effective than others. And you'd have to say more of a threat perhaps than over here when we had, the Edelweiss Pirates or the Swing Kids, perhaps even more of a threat than the White Rose group, the students. And finally, perhaps the most notable threat of all was the July bomb plot, the July 1944 bomb plot. This was the attempt to assassinate Hitler by setting off a bomb at the Wolf's Lair in Prussia, where Hitler was meeting for a military meeting in July 1944, July the 20th, actually, 1944. The man given the job of killing Hitler was Klaus von Stauffenberg. He was the leader of Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie was an attempt to kill Hitler, to arrest leaders of the SS, and to basically to have a revolution in Germany, to get rid of the Nazis and replace them with a provisional government. Stauffenberg's plan was to put a bomb in a briefcase, travel by plane to the Wolf's Lair, go into the briefing room where Hitler would be given his morning briefing by senior generals, to put his briefcase under that table and to set a charge in there. And once he'd left, the bomb was to go off. Unfortunately, that all went to plan, but somebody actually, first of all, the hut that they were in was an open plan hut, not the concrete bunker that Stauffenberg was hoping for. So the first thing, I suppose, there that went wrong was the actual bunker was an open bunker, and that allowed the blast to I suppose you'd say, kind of come out of there. It wasn't the impact wasn't enclosed in the bunker, so it kind of blasted out of the windows. The second thing is his briefcase was moved. It must have slipped in the room, and one of the generals actually moved it. Unfortunately, they moved it away from Hitler, who survived the bomb attack. Hitler survived, and because he survived, the war obviously carried on until May 1945. You would have to say that looking at that, it was opposition was there, but it was limited, and most of it failed.